The most dangerous sentence in this war was not about missiles, not about carriers, not even about the Strait of Hormuz. It was the sentence about power plants. I want to start there because a lot of people still hear a threat against power plants and think in the old military vocabulary. They imagine pressure. They imagine leverage. They imagine some larger version of bombing an airfield or disabling a radar site. That is not what this is. Once a president openly says that if a shipping lane is not reopened within 48 hours, the response will be to obliterate the largest power stations of a country of 87 million people, we are no longer talking about a normal escalation ladder. We are talking about a war moving from military confrontation into the direct targeting of the systems that keep civilian life physically possible. That is the threshold I want people to understand. When Donald Trump posted that message, he did not threaten to degrade a launch site or hit a command bunker. He threatened to begin with the biggest plant first. That phrase matters because it tells you the logic. The logic is not tactical, it is systemic. Hit the largest node, trigger the broadest cascade, create pressure not on a division or a fleet, but on the whole society beneath the state. And once you think clearly about electricity, the whole picture changes. Electricity is not a convenience. Electricity is the base layer of modern life. Hospitals are electricity, water treatment is electricity, sewage is electricity, refrigeration is electricity, communications are electricity. Heating in cold regions is electricity, industrial production is electricity, distribution networks are electricity. Even many of the emergency systems that are supposed to soften wartime collapse depend on electricity. So when people use military language to sanitize what this kind of strike would mean, they are hiding the most important reality. If you remove major power generation from a country already under military pressure, you do not merely dim its skyline. You begin to attack the conditions of survival. That is why I keep saying this moment may be more dangerous than many of the missile exchanges that came before it. A missile duel can still be understood inside the logic of armed contest. One side tries to degrade the other's capabilities. One side signals resolve, the other responds. It is dangerous, yes, but it still sits inside the familiar architecture of state conflict. Once you move toward electricity grids and major power plants, you create reverberating effects that spread far beyond any military target list. A strike may last minutes. The civilian consequences can last weeks, months, even years. And now look at the Iranian response, because Tehran understood the humanitarian mirror image immediately. The answer was not only about retaliation against American or Israeli military assets. The answer explicitly mentioned Gulf energy infrastructure and desalination facilities. Again, people hear those words and still think they are hearing ordinary strategic signaling. They are not. In the Gulf, desalination is not a side issue. It is not a backup utility. In several states, it is the source of daily life itself. Without desalination, water security stops being a policy issue and becomes a population survival issue. So what Iran was really saying was very simple. If you strike what keeps our people alive, we will strike what keeps your regional partners alive. This is why I say the war is approaching a cliff edge. Each side is now threatening the civilian life support architecture of the other side's social order. Iran's grid on one side, Gulf water and energy systems on the other. And if that exchange begins, the map of consequences changes immediately. Inside Iran, the result would not be some clean television-friendly display of American power. It would be urban breakdown. It would be disruptions to water safety. It would be hospital stress. It would be food chain disruption. It would be secondary mortality caused not by blast, but by system failure. That is what modern infrastructure war does. It kills by cascade across the Gulf. The result would not be some manageable retaliatory inconvenience. It would be a simultaneous threat to oil export nodes, pipelines, terminals, and the desalination systems that support cities whose freshwater alternatives are minimal. In other words, once this threshold is crossed, we are no longer only talking about oil prices. We are talking about whether some of the most energy-critical states in the world can sustain both export capacity and daily urban life under pressure. That is why I believe this ultimatum is so historically significant. It compresses a war of attrition into a single forced choice that can damage the legitimacy of every actor involved. Now, let me explain the strategic trap. If Trump follows through, he proves that his threats are not empty. On the narrow question of credibility, that matters. A president who states a deadline and then acts can claim that red line still means, but the cost of that proof may be catastrophic. The strike itself would likely trigger the exact reciprocal escalation Iran has already announced. Gulf infrastructure would move to the top of the retaliation ladder. Energy prices would surge again. Markets would not see a limited punitive action. Markets would see a transition into an infrastructure war with open-ended consequences. And diplomatically, the United States would find itself defending attacks on objects indispensable to civilian survival. That is not a comfortable position for any government that wants to claim moral or legal legitimacy. If Trump does not follow through, a different damage occurs. Then the problem becomes the erosion of deterrence. Every actor in the region, from Tehran to Riyadh to Beijing, will ask the same question: how many American deadlines are real if a 48-hour ultimatum tied to one of the most sensitive waterways on Earth expires without consequence? That is not just a missed threat. It is strategic information. It reveals where the political system hesitates. It teaches adversaries how far they can press. It teaches allies that protection may be conditional, delayed, or rhetorically inflated. In deterrence theory, credibility is not a slogan. It is a form of transmitted expectation. Once that expectation weakens, future crises become harder to manage. So here is the terrible structure of the moment. If he acts, he may ignite a larger regional infrastructure war. If he does not act, he may hollow out American credibility further. That is why I say the ultimatum is not only directed at Iran. In a strange way, it traps Washington too. It creates a scenario in which both compliance and non-compliance carry strategic cost, and in which even a nominal success can look ambiguous. Because suppose Hormuz begins to reopen. Was that because Iran chose to yield, or because Iranian capability had already been degraded enough that the closure could not be sustained? Those are not the same political story. But in real time, they become blurred. And when stories blur, leaders often compensate with larger gestures, louder rhetoric, and riskier acts. That is exactly the kind of environment in which wars jump tracks. I also want to stress something that I think many observers still underestimate. The issue is not simply whether the American military can damage Iran's infrastructure. Of course it can. The issue is whether doing so produces the intended strategic outcome. That is a different question entirely. It is one thing to destroy. It is another thing to coerce. It is one thing to demonstrate force. It is another thing to produce a stable political result from that force. History is full of cases where militarily powerful states confuse damage with control. You can hit power stations, you can hit terminals, you can hit depots. But once the conflict reorganizes itself around societal endurance, national humiliation, civilian suffering, and reciprocal punishment, the side with greater hardware does not automatically gain greater political leverage. In fact, sometimes the opposite happens. Large-scale external pressure can tighten national cohesion, harden internal narratives, and justify further escalation by the targeted state. This is especially true when the population believes that the basic conditions of life are being threatened from outside. That is why the rhetoric of obliteration is so dangerous. It does not only threaten infrastructure, it feeds a narrative, and narratives in wartime are not decoration, they are fuel. From Tehran's perspective, the perfect story is not one in which Iran wins a conventional battle with the United States. That was never the real requirement. The more realistic objective is to turn American involvement into a generator of cost instability, diplomatic fatigue, and ally anxiety. If Washington then escalates into civilian life support systems, Tehran can present itself not only as resisting pressure, but as enduring an existential assault that strengthens mobilization. It widens sympathy among populations already hostile to American intervention, and it raises the political price of continued U.S. action. Now, widen the frame one more time. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a local waterway, it is a global choke point. Gulf oil infrastructure is not just regional property. It is a central input into the world economy. Desalination in the Gulf is not just an engineering topic. It is the means by which several states sustain urban life. Iran's electricity grid is not just a technical network. It is the skeletal system of a country of 87 million people. So when leaders start talking casually about obliterating major nodes in these systems, they are not discussing a normal battlefield exchange. They are discussing whether the war will move into the architecture of civilization itself. That is why financial markets react so sharply. They are not only pricing barrels of oil, they are pricing systemic uncertainty. They are pricing the possibility that a military contest becomes an infrastructure crisis, that an infrastructure crisis becomes a humanitarian crisis, and that a humanitarian crisis becomes a legitimacy crisis for every government entangled in it. And once legitimacy becomes unstable, escalation is harder to stop because every actor starts acting not only for material advantage, but for political survival. That is what makes these 48 hours so dangerous. It is not just the deadline on paper. It is the structure. A threat has been made that is too large to ignore and too costly to execute cleanly. A counter threat has been issued that mirrors the same logic against another population's survival systems. The military facts are entangled with political theater. The humanitarian consequences are entangled with deterrence. And the entire region is now waiting to see whether the next move will be a strike, a bluff, a compromise disguised as success, or a failure disguised as restraint. My own judgment is that once a war starts talking openly about power plants, desalination systems, and the societal base layer of civilian life, the danger is no longer measured only in the tonnage of munitions or the number of missiles intercepted. The danger is measured in how fast the conflict is learning to punish vulnerability itself. That is the real threshold here. Not who can sink more ships, not who can issue the louder statement, not who can dominate one news cycle. The real threshold is whether this war is now crossing from the destruction of military capability into the destruction of life support systems. Because once that line is crossed, it becomes much harder for anyone to claim that they are still controlling the war. At that point, the war begins controlling them,